Disco Elysium is a unique role-playing game with a unique question in the advertising copy. What kind of cop are you? Seems like an interesting premise, right? A detective RPG? Disco Elysium is much, much more than that. Yet the simple frame of that question, the player's copotype and the inherent contradiction between inflexibility of law and freedom of player expression, is a foundation stable enough to support a whole little universe of ideas on top of it. It's hardly the first RPG to have to get a little experimental to focus on law-bringing. Dungeons & Dragons itself has struggled for years with making its paladin class appealing to play. Prior to 5th edition, they were bound to the lawful good alignment, and any deviation would cause the class to lock itself and invalidate a player's progress. This tight ideological restriction made them deeply inflexible. Dungeon masters could vary in how strictly they monitored player behavior, but for years the class languished because a paladin's presence in the party meant that out of any innumerable number of fantastic things in an imaginary wonderland, the player wanted to be a cop. Being a cop in Fantasyland narrows the range of what you can creatively accomplish by a considerable amount. You start out with inherent, irresolvable conflicts with a large number of common player builds, like thieves and warlocks and such. Dungeons & Dragons came up with a solution to make paladins ideological zealots of customizable ideology instead of the limiting, prescriptive, lawful good requirement. Now, in 5th edition, the player chooses a particular oath of fealty to some ideal of law, of vengeance, of honor, that kind of thing. What differentiates them from fighters is much less the divine spellcasting than it is these zealous fixations on how the universe should be ordered. What sets them apart is that they fight not for gold, not for glory, but because of an opinion. Disco Elysium was influenced by and is often compared to the classic, highly experimental RPG Planescape Torment, but before diving into any of that, it's important to think of not just the way it was influenced by Torment, but by the way the two games interactively critique the source material of tabletop role-playing in parallel. Planescape Torment deconstructed the idea of player control over their character. It gave the protagonist lifetimes of differing, contradictory choices and incarnations the player had to incorporate and reckon with, instead of simply projecting onto a blank slate. This gave present-tense choices a lot of extra weight and meaning as you discovered who you used to be, as you questioned whether you had changed or if change was possible. Disco Elysium explores these themes as well, with some critical differences. The biggest difference is in class. You don't choose between fighter, wizard, and rogue. You're cop. Paladin class, the law. Except Disco Elysium knows better than anyone how useless a broad, one-size-fits-all understanding of paladins as being lawful good across the board can be. It's not the law that's compelling. It's the zealotry. It's the opinion having. Not just having an opinion, but living an opinion. Being a person who is, essentially, opinion made manifest. A surprising amount of law enforcement work boils down to exactly that. Judges, for example, quite literally manifest opinion as law, and even the most diligent and professional investigator can only use the evidence to construct a coherent narrative. Ideally, this narrative is close enough to the truth to settle the issue. Often, it is not. Because the law is not objective. It is not a cosmological constant like it is in Dungeons & Dragons. Making law, enforcing law, even understanding what defines law, all of it varies from person to person, court to court, precinct to precinct. From this perspective, a detective RPG is just as creatively free as any flight of fancy possible in Dungeons & Dragons, the player's perspective just as critical or more so. Because justice itself is a matter of opinion. In a lot of the framing and structure, Disco Elysium sure is similar to Planescape Torment. Both begin with an amnesiac protagonist, providing a blank slate for world-building and player-driven characterization. Both force you to reconcile those newer choices with the old choices you discover along the way. Both take place in extremely dense, intricate areas with sprawling conversation trees, in preference to more traditionally isometric environments with more gameplay-driven concerns. Both are more interested in the interior lives of their characters than the bits and pieces of their plots. And they have, the same font. But I don't want to spend a huge amount of time and effort comparing and contrasting the two, because despite all of the many, many borrowed structures and motifs, Disco Elysium is a unique experience from Torment, and comparing the two seems to me to diminish the individuality that shines so brightly in the separate play experiences of each. Compared to Disco Elysium, Torment feels extremely personal, focused on shades of the self, past selves, present selves. The climax of the whole game is a boss fight with your disconnected soul, and it involves learning your true name. It feels more emotional than most computer role-playing games because of the way it becomes a self-reflective experience in a more substantial way than, I was nice because I didn't ask for gold after killing that dragon. The focus on the interplay between player self and protagonist selves is its strength as a game, and as a meaningful riff on the traditionally party-focused D&D universe. It's also a weakness when you compare it to Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium, while being less overtly emotional, takes the writing style pioneered by Torment and moves it a step further by relentlessly connecting the player to the larger perspective, to the stories running in parallel to their own. It illuminates the inadequacies of the self as often or more often than it probes the self's depth of meaning. Not only does it show the disparity between stock standard RPG choices like refuse gold for dragon slaying, and what's possible when you make the effort to add more literary nuance to the choices, it will continue on to point out that it doesn't even matter if you refuse the reward gold because the dragon had a hoard of treasure, which you took for yourself, and what's more, you could probably buy and sell this whole shitty kingdom for the price of your magical +2 to dexterity codpiece, so why don't you stop being a hypocrite, take the quest reward, and consider not being so fucking condescending to the locals? Disco Elysium is fanatically committed to deconstructing the player-driven experience in a way that Planescape instead adapted and modified to suit its creative purposes. Torment is still all about the player character. Disco Elysium is, no matter how many actual hundreds of rabbit holes and diversions it goes down, about the case. Despite everything, on top of everything, encompassing everything, it is a murder mystery. Torment existed in D&D's Planescape setting, where thought and belief are made manifest as real places, real beings of law and chaos, good and evil, with ever-shifting neutral ground in between. A major plot point in Planescape Torment hinges on the beliefs of a city shifting so much that it tips from one plane of existence into another. Reality in Disco Elysium, no matter its own cosmological peculiarities, is not quite so fungible. There was a murder. It happened. A sequence of events led up to it, connected the actors of its tale. There is an actual objective truth in Disco Elysium in a way that there is not in Planescape Torment. The real question is if you'll ever be able to get your shit together enough to find that truth. It's easy to get wrapped up in the many and deliberate similarities between the games. By the time it was over, what I cared about more when it comes to Disco Elysium was all the ways in which it found its own absolutely unique creative voice. The choices you make about your inner self don't impact the outer world in the same way as Torment, a small fundamental difference at the absolute root of the game that causes the entire beast to mutate and change. While you level up and spend points in Disco Elysium the same way you would any RPG, each skill represents a divided aspect of the self. If you were a whole, healthy person, you would be able to have strong stats across the board. You are not. You are an old, dried-up disco nightmare who was assigned to the case days ago and has spent the entire time diving into a drinking binge that was such an earnest attempt at self-annihilation, you wake up having forgotten everything. You are so medically hungover that turning on the overhead lights kills a number of players in the first room of the game from the shock of it. In this case, you've just got to slink out of the darkness of your trashed hotel room like the scum you must have felt like to get so down and dirty drunk. It's an old trope, but it's used to great effect here because of an important question it provokes and the answers the game soon provides. Question: aren't you supposed to be some kind of cop? Answer: yeah, but you haven't even started yet, and there are apparently zero expectations for how you go about it. Any progress is better than no progress on the case, so there isn't exactly a bad choice. Even getting trashed and ignoring the case entirely is consistent, at least, with your behavior so far. From the first room in the opening exposition, this amnesia trope has been set to purpose, clearing the slate for you to investigate not only the case, but the city, the self, the directions to a guy who can get you some speed. It positions your character in such a way that copotypes, way beyond lawful good, become not only possible and permissible, but preferable as well. One of your first investigatory acts is to witness yourself in the bathroom mirror, and it's one of the most truly funny moments I've seen in a game. The humor is sharp and acidic a lot of the time with Disco Elysium, but it's also sympathetic and goofy in equal measure, and all four moods of comedy start off strong in this single scene where you wipe the fog and confront the fact of yourself. It's a relatable scene generally, but it's especially relatable from a perspective of unhealthy insobriety. When it comes to drugs, it's a common experience that sometimes you don't realize how goddamn high you are until you go into the bathroom with the mirror and the bright lights, and then look out, man! What is this creature with the wide pupils and splotches of red and all the sweat? I mean, God, how did you get so moist? Same for a hangover, but with dread instead of curiosity. There's a detective inside every drunk. There has to be. There was a while in my early 20s where I was getting blackout a few times a week, for more hours some nights and less on others, and the mornings and afternoons that followed were always an investigation, with myself as the primary suspect. A friend tells an anecdote. Quick, ask for clarification or laugh politely without knowing why. Oh shit, this guy's pretty mad at me. But why? Was it bad? How bad? Sometimes it seems good. The anecdote is about you, and it's positive. You were cool. You were charming. You were on that night. Right on. Too bad you can't remember it for shit. You wonder about the self you blacked out for. Are they different or what? Stranger or friend? Billy Joel came down on the side of stranger in his song of the same name, singing, "You may never understand how the stranger is inspired, but he isn't always evil, and he is not always wrong." The developers aren't guessing here either. Studio co-founder Robert Kurvitz said in an interview with GamesRadar that the game came on the back of a really dark period in his life. He said, quote, "I wasn't going to do a video game. I was thinking that we'd failed in other things, and I was just going to keep drinking," end quote. In that same article, developer Alexander Rostov recalls Kurvitz eventually coming to him with the idea anyway. Rostov says, quote, "He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'My friend, we failed at so many things. Let us also fail at making a video game,' end quote. Regret and pain inform the work of Disco Elysium. Yes, the game presents drugs and alcohol in a way that is often manic and goofy, but only because the reason people gravitate to alcohol and drugs is that they make a person feel manic and goofy. Why even start drinking early in the day, after all? Well, that's easy. You limit the hours that you feel like yourself. You get a head start on feeling ready instead, even if it's an unsteady ready. This isn't like a Far Cry game going, "Look at all the wacky, wavy colors. Drugs, man, far out." The insobriety is absurdist and comic because being insober is absurdist and comic, and the writing is, in some ways, nostalgic if you've struggled with that sort of thing. The stranger, he isn't always evil, and he isn't always wrong. Party Self loves to party. He would party forever if naps were also made available. Nothing says the party is over in a more existentially cruel and savage way than looking in the mirror and realizing that the years have accumulated on your face, hanging in dull sacks under your eyes, while you have been partying. The whole world has moved on. You have not. Disco never dies is a phrase that progresses from declaration to threat to curse, a rare case of terminal night fever. Thing is, this is the beginning of the game, not the end. As deep in the shit as you are, any point is a starting point for change, amnesia providing a cleaner slate than normal. Or, as Billy Joel put it, don't be afraid to try again. Everyone goes south, every now and then. Disco Elysium disagrees with Billy Joel in that the unknown self is neither stranger nor friend, but a chorus of contradictory, competing suggestions from unreliable impulses. Not only does Disco Elysium say this thematically and dramatically, it's the fundamental mechanical structure of the entire game. You have 4 categories of stat, which the skills are divided into: physique, motorics, or more traditionally agility, intellect, and psyche. The skills within those trees function very non-traditionally. In every conversation, the game makes background dice rolls on all of your skills, and if one of them is relevant and passes the check, it renders an opinion on your current situation and often opens up an extra line of dialogue. Straightforward enough, right? Except that rarely, if ever, do these voices give what you'd call a right answer, or a dialogue choice guaranteed to advance the conversation in the most efficient manner. Instead, these voices are fallible and intrusive, correct in their assumptions just often enough to lull you into trusting them at the wrong moments. In other words, Disco Elysium's character system is less about managing strengths and weaknesses, so much as it is about formatting the interiorality of your main character. Different builds don't yield differences in the outcome of the case. These facts are mostly set in stone, but they vastly alter the way in which you interact with and understand other characters in the game. Grappling with the personalities of these divided aspects of self is one of the game's most challenging and fascinating parts. Take the skill Inland Empire, for example. This is your imagination. Put points into it, and your imagination will chime in constantly, and it very frequently does add new dialogue choices to conversation menus. Never once did a single dialogue choice from Inland Empire help me solve the case. But what did I expect? What it did help me with was forming theories with why a commercial district might be supernaturally cursed. It helped me visualize creatures that don't exist and allowed me to propose theories for the homicide that would require magic to be real and fairy tales to be true if they were ever going to be relevant. My partner, the unflappably professional Lieutenant Kim Kitsuragi, could not stand these tangents, yet other characters found them endearing. Sometimes. The city of Revachol and the world of Disco Elysium is dismal, bleak, a place of few opportunities and fewer surprises. To be capable of the kind of optimistic, unself-conscious whimsy suggested by the Inland Empire skill in the face of all of that is a rare thing in the world, and it comforts some people to see it, less often than it annoys the serious folk, but the comfort is more powerful than the annoyance when it does come up. So, Inland Empire helps you solve the murder not at all. In fact, it actively makes you worse at it because of how divorced from logic and objective reality you come across as. But it helps you talk to people. Not all people. Some people. People who have, within them, an Inland Empire as well. By contrast, investing heavily in the skills of logic and rhetoric will make you slightly better at the case, but an absolute nightmare for trying to get people to confide in you and tell you true things. You become an argumentation machine. No tangent too winding to pin down and counter-argue. No casual aside so casual you can't harangue a person into giving you a proof. No idea worthy of being dismissed outright before you've taken the mallet of your intellect to it and hammered it into a powder you can snort up in a roaringly powerful line. Time passes in Disco Elysium based on dialogue. Each statement has a time value associated with it, and the day advances primarily through spoken dialogue. You can add practically half a day to your week-long investigation by choosing this character build, going round after rhetorical round with the entire city. There's a murder, sure, but isn't the real crime in Revachol sloppy and emotional thinking? There are moments when logic was extremely helpful to the case, like in Forensics, and moments where trusting in logic alienated people from me and set me back a few steps. The amount of care put into conceptualizing not only each of the many aspects of self, but their interactivity with one another, the exclusive interactivity oftentimes, and with the world in differing proportions, is staggering in its complexity. A lot of time in RPGs, a dialogue tree is straightforwardly a tree. There is a trunk, there are branches. Disco Elysium's dialogue is a bramble thicket in comparison. No trunk, no root, nothing simple or visually coherent, just a darkening tangle of larger and smaller branches going back and back into shadow and dirt. Conceptualization is even its own skill, used occasionally in the case, but much more often in trying to puzzle out the art of the world and figure out what people are up to with their passion projects. Most notably, it's the skill through which the developers share their anxieties about Disco Elysium as a game project with the player. Deep in the shuttered corridors behind the bookstore is a game studio that had this bold, beautiful vision for what a role-playing game could be. It never came to anything. With enough conceptualization, you come to understand not only the intention of the game, but where it went wrong and why it never happened. It talks about how the developers never truly had the pragmatism to do it. They would show up late, work in fits, sulk in bouts, and all of this was bad, but what did them in was ambition. It talks about a secret feature which would have required a nigh infinite amount of variable possibilities. If you say, it couldn't be that bad, the game will positively crush you with an endless wall of numbers demonstrating its point. More, Revachol is an old city, a dying city, and an obscure city. No one makes games there, let alone imaginary role-playing games on a radio computer. Disco Elysium itself was made in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, an ancient country that was an annex into the Soviet Union and has been recovering unevenly ever since. Disco Elysium had literally everything in the world working against it as far as being an international hit goes, let alone nominations for Game of the Year across multiple award categories and winning multiple Best Narrative awards against games with budgets and resources completely dwarfing Disco Elysium's. The game was largely financed by the sale of one of the developer's only truly valuable possessions, a Ferrari, once owned by Dolph Lundgren. Weird world, right? More than that, however, is the reason for those awards, the obvious and impressive craft on display, not just in the quality of the writing, but the complex systems that arrange and display the writing. Failure is something that the game incorporates into its very fabric, where dice rolls make it so that nothing is impossible, and nothing is a sure thing. Even at a 3% chance, you can succeed in a roll. Even at a 97% chance, you can fail. If you fail, however, you get to try again in the vast majority of circumstances. You can raise the skill a point and come back to re-roll the outcome. The shuttered development house, the game destroyed by its own complexity and the creative habits of its developers, this was extremely likely to have been the fate of Disco Elysium. But it wasn't. They rolled double sixes, and the game is already internationally regarded as a modern classic. I think Disco Elysium is better than Planescape Torment, in terms of how I related to it and how I was moved by it. I didn't expect to feel that way about it. It's all these anxieties and pains that the developers put into it that elevates it to that position for me. Planescape Torment is incredible, amazingly detailed, beautifully heartfelt, conceptually fascinating. What it's missing is that sense of who is on the other end of the screen, who made the game, why, what they wanted to say, and how it challenges who I am and how I am. In that Games Radar interview, Kervit said, quote, "This creative outlet for us was incredibly difficult to achieve, and every day I'm making fucking sure I'm putting every piece of anger and pain into it." End quote. There is a quality to the game that is overwhelmingly raw and vulnerable, seething with resentment and confusion. touching Disco Elysium is electric, a live wire of emotion. It is simply unlike anything I've played before. No doubt there will be games influenced by it the way it was influenced by Planescape Torment, but none will ever feel quite the same way, because it is personal, in a way games so rarely are with large development teams and pervasive corporate accountability. On the surface, Disco Elysium is impressive and charming. Conceptualizing it, Disco Elysium is impossible. Everything was stacked against it, up to and including its own ambition. Despite common wisdom, despite industry trends, despite the sense you can't put serious real-world politics in a game. Because that's the other miracle of Disco Elysium. While its beauty comes from its willingness to dip into the personal, that beauty has an edge to it that goes on to demolish any illusion that the personal is separable from the political. If people have a problem with Disco Elysium, it's usually about the communism. This is on account of how the game systematically shuts down any attempt to disengage with the politics of its world by weaving its entire universe from the cloth of ideology. The case is the best illustration of this. The murder happened. There are unalterable facts. When you unravel those facts, they go back nearly 50 years to a failed communist revolution and all the pain and failure that has echoed down through the city decade after decade in its wake. It's a perspective that could really only have come from an Eastern European developer. The way the game talks about communism and ideology is wide-ranging and individualized in a way that simply never happens in America, where the basic popular conception of what communism is wildly distorted compared to the rest of the world. You'll get called a communist in America for advocating for pretty much anything that isn't explicitly arranged around an idea of winners and losers, for any kind of talk about common good or shit like that. Disco Elysium goes way further, way harder on the communism front. Its most savage political critiques aren't reserved for fascists and authoritarians. It takes for granted that there will always be these people and that they're shitty people in a very boring and predictable way. No, the claws come out for people who talk about the common good but don't do anything about it. People who believe in essential goodness and appeals to better nature even as the world crumbles around them into sickness and rot. People like me. A common YouTube comment I get is to have folks accusing me of being a leftist propagandist and an extremist, which has always struck me as especially funny because on the spectrum of leftist thought, I have always been safely boring at best and a reflexive apologist at worst. In a lot of ways, it is role-playing games that have informed my interior morality. When I was young, I had a home life that was extremely bleak to the point that the courts were frequently involved. Video games helped me escape that, but RPGs took it a step further for me because they let me have a voice, an opinion, in ways reality would never allow me. Being the hero was always the most exciting for me because of the fantasy that I could change the world for the better. Fallout was the first RPG I got really into. I was fascinated by the idea that this desolate, broken place could be healed by my actions by the time the epilogue slides arrived. That I could be selfless and giving in a wasteland that did nothing but take and punish. I've tried to take the best of that impulse with me growing up, in that doing the right thing is always an active choice. You have to inconvenience yourself and give of yourself from time to time if you want to achieve a pro-social outcome. There's a negative side to it too, however. RPGs also teach you that you're qualified to make these choices and dictate these outcomes. Being fantasy, this is fine. Take that impulse into reality with you, though, and you're suddenly stuck in a thought mire where you have a very prescriptive idea of what good behavior and good living is, and then when people disappoint and circumvent these standards, you judge them for it, even when you don't know shit about the particular circumstances that prompt these failures to meet your standards. It becomes easy to read an article or listen to a news segment and have a very strong opinion, not just strong, but correct, informed by your good intentions and vetted by whatever friend or loved one you say it to, who nod and sagely say, "Yeah, right on, man." The size and complexity of the broader world disappears under the wallpaper of ought to be and, well, ideally. In Disco Elysium, this impulse is politically represented by the Moral Intern, a foreign coalition of powers who crushed the revolution in Revachol a half-century back and have been administrating the city ever since. The revolution was violent. It upset the status quo, and so it was only correct to nip it in the bud, do a little war, just a tiny one, and then get things back to normal. Ultra-liberals, the capitalist true believers of the Moral Intern call themselves. Hypocrites, fools, and shitheels, the game calls them. Thing is, if I was following my impulse from RPGs past, the impulse from childhood I've kept cozy and fed all my life, I inevitably choose these ultra-liberal compromises and dodges and obfuscations. Surely, things won't be so bad if we recontextualize what's bad about it, right? I put a few points into rhetoric, so it should be really convincing. Often it does sound convincing, but it's hollow. it's been hollow for me for a few years now. Is Disco Elysium judging me, the player? Is it calling me out? Yes, and I agree with it completely. Before you finish typing your comment about what kind of idiot gets their politics from a game, let me clarify that I'm not saying Disco Elysium changed my mind about anything fundamental. It's that my old satisfactions in pretending to be the hero and my old assumptions about the essential decency of institutional systems feel increasingly naive and meaningless. 2020 has been a strange year for everyone, but it's been particularly surreal to be an American because of how completely it seems we've abandoned the grand pretense of what the country is supposed to be about, to instead squabble over who gets to paint their face in the ashes of what we've let it become. The effect is like dropping cotton candy into a puddle for someone who's a true believer in the American concept, a land where equality and individualism can coexist peacefully, where truth is respected, justice is possible, and where self-reinvention is a celebrated achievement. Sure, things aren't much that way right now, but they could be, right? If people operated in good faith. In Disco Elysium, the ultra-liberal perspective is represented by Joyce Messier, a yacht-bound executive who's come to try and keep an eye on the brewing labor dispute that seems to lie at the heart of the murder investigation. Joyce is an especially fascinating character because the game makes no attempt to portray her as stupid or unappealing. On the contrary, she's one of the most truly charming people that you meet, one of the richest, and in some ways, one of the coolest. She's one of the only people in the game who remembers disco music with the same deep fondness as your character. I bonded a lot with her on that front. What is disco music, after all, but an unironic appeal to the universe that things will be fine and will all be okay? Disco music was the first genre to give us the 8-minute extended dance loop. The entire point is just to lose yourself to the beat, catch the boogie fever, let the decay and collapse outside of the club fade away and fracture into 1,000 points of light reflected in the mirrored ball. Disco comes up a lot in the game, but you don't have to be a Bee Gees kind of person to understand what it symbolizes here. Disco is a hopeful optimism in the face of reality. One of the last times you talk to Joyce, you have to render an important verdict. The labor dispute is no small thing, and it's an attempt by the local unions to start a war. The future of the city is at stake. No option will prevent violence. Even the most moralist of them just kicks the can down the line to a greater, unseen conflict. You can respond with nearly a dozen options, advocating the unions, demanding the unions be violently suppressed, blaming different people, punishing different groups. One potential response is, I wish there was a disco option. I laughed so hard I almost started crying. I had rarely felt so seen by a video game. Seen and judged, yes, but that's fucking life, isn't it? All the ideals in the world and all the good intentions I can cram in my mouth at any given time don't add up to anything at all in the face of the complex cruelties of the world and its entrenched systems. Every day I read the news, every day I go out into the world, I wish there was a disco option. There is not. My insistence on holding on to the possibility of one is itself a little childish. Joyce may relate to the protagonist about yearning for a boogie wonderland, but she is one of the least likely people to ever shift the world towards one. Not everyone gets to gallivant around making the big choices and sailing in yachts. Yet that's the hero's trajectory in so many RPGs. More power, more loot, more. And essentially ultra-liberal fixation when you break it down like that. The fantasies that sustained me when I was younger feel increasingly hollow as I age, and Disco Elysium is one of the first times I've been confronted with that within the medium itself. Not only does it confront that tension, it lets me deconstruct and recontextualize the Chosen One fantasy using the very same format and language that I first internalized it through. Despite how some folks talk about it, Disco Elysium doesn't actually position communism as the solution to the problem. Another feature of the game's character system is the thought mechanic, contextual research projects where you encounter things or react to things in a way that gives you a big idea. You get penalties to your skills while you're thinking about it because it's distracting you, but when you've completed your thought, there are more permanent bonuses or sometimes penalties. An early contextual example is trying to remember where you got the stupid look on your face when you see it in the mirror and distantly recall that it has to do with the former disco idol William Lemillion. Remembering him will allow you to invoke the old superstar in side conversations later on, and it provides a small bonus. Slightly different are the ideological thoughts, which come up after choosing multiple responses along a certain frame of perspective. Choose communism enough, and you get the thought, Mazovian socioeconomics. The text for it while you're thinking it goes, quote, People think communism was some crazy idea that had its comeuppance 40 years ago, a fever that shook the world, never to return again. They were right. until he woke up today. A spiritual corpse, responsive only to the call of Commodore Red, prostitutes, and Krasmazov. For him, communism is still a thing. He will single-handedly raise the commune of O2 from the oceanic trench where it has been resting, covered in ghosts and seaweed. He is the big communism builder. Come, witness his attempt to rebuild communism in the year 51. Then, when you've spent some hours thinking about it, you conclude 0.000% of communism has ever been built. Evil, child-murdering billionaires still rule the world with a shit-eating grin. All he has managed to do is make himself sad. He is starting to suspect Krasmazov fucked him over personally with his socio-economic theory. It has, however, made him into a very, very smart boy with something like a university degree in truth. Instead of building communism, he now builds a precise model of this grotesque, duplicitous world. End quote. You get a -1 to your authority skill, a -1 to your visual calculus, which is a skill that allows you to deduce patterns of action from a crime scene, but you do get extra experience points from leftist dialogue choices, forming a positive feedback loop for you to continue advocating for a philosophy that has not made you personally any happier. The biggest fundamental problem of communism is one the game spends an incredible amount of time exploring, the problem that it is an idealized system built on learned behavior and selfless behavior, whereas capitalism is more conveniently rooted in predation, greed, and chaos, impulses which come to most of us a little more naturally than from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. It depends on the good faith of everyone involved to an even greater degree than the system is it's trying to replace, and the virtues of its ideals are even more vulnerable to corruption as a result. Even in our world, if you talk to communists, the general consensus is that 0.0% of communism has ever been built today, that the Soviet state and the incredible violence of the Maoist regime don't truly count because they were skewed away from the ideals of true revolution by autocratic figures. The developers are quite openly and proudly communist, but they've come to that conclusion in the wake of true first-hand knowledge of the failure of the Soviet state. Hence the sadness, the longing, the bittersweet acknowledgement of the contradictions inherent in a political solution that both has and has not been tried, depending on who you talk to. Personally, the thing I struggle the most with when it comes to Marxism is Marx, who is an asshole. In Chapter 2, arguably the spiciest chapter of the Communist Manifesto, Marx writes, quote, "Don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standards of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of the existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social form springing for your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property." End quote. It would be of tremendous benefit to the United States if more angry conservatives actually bothered to read the Communist Manifesto, because when you do get into it, it's a lot. It is an extremely severe and prescriptive document in a way that Manifesto only halfway conveys. It is alternately smug and belligerent throughout. Or it strikes me that way anyway, because he's correct. My very ideas are but the outgrowth of my bourgeois circumstances. I like my ideas, though. I've kept them because they're my favorites. Put it another way, I am too willfully American to be persuaded by Marxism fully. My concept of what freedom is, which Marx gets super combative about in that very same chapter, just can't abide by the way the manifesto absolutely insists that everything must be demolished of the old culture, the old understandings of freedom and justice. It's actually a major hurdle to get over for a lot of people, politically. So while socialism and socialistic tendencies are certainly on the rise, 95% of what people usually call communism isn't even close to being on the same wavelength as Marx and the manifesto in terms of its proposed solutions to the problem. What's enduringly appealing about the manifesto and communism is the exact same thing that Disco Elysium touched on while figuring that Krasmazov, it's Karl Marx-alike, may have personally fucked the protagonist over. Marxist critical theory is, even or perhaps especially if you don't go all the way into full Marxist communism, a precise model of this grotesque and duplicitous world. Its understanding of the structures of power, the corruption and rot those systems of oppression create, the intergenerational lengths those structures will go to continue holding on to power, all of this is mostly right on the nose and incredibly useful in understanding how things came to be the way they are in the world today, socially, economically, culturally even to a certain extent. What's weird about it is that Marxist communism just doesn't seem to have many safeguards at all in the manifesto about what happens when corruption and rot set into the revolution. Marx writes, quote, "When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled, by the force of circumstance, to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and, as such, sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." End quote. This assumption that flip-flopping the class dynamic will manage to resolve itself by the new rulers abolishing their own supremacy as a class is a very, very large leap of faith. Disco Elysium agrees with Marx about a lot of things. I never got the impression it much agreed with him about that. If it did, Evert Clare would not be such a prominent, unavoidable character. Evert runs the Dockworkers Union, which in terms of actual power in Revachol means that he runs the city. He shut down the docks, previously run by a foreign company called White Pines, and plans to seize them entirely for the Union. At the heart of this plot is the murder that you wake up having made so little effort to solve that the corpse is still hanging from the tree where it's been rotting for a week. On the second day of the investigation, Everett's dockworkers openly admit to hanging the man and dare you to do anything about it. The way the case evolves and shifts over time is fascinating, but this early development is one of the most interesting because of the implications. Either they did do it, and the situation in the city is so volatile that it favors them getting away with it, or they didn't do it, but having an atmosphere in the city where lynchings are taking place extrajudiciously is advantageous to someone. Either way, the murder is more than a murder. It's the first move in some kind of massive and unseen game at the top of the city. The thing is, in my playthrough, I got double sixes at a very critical juncture. I was doing the autopsy on the corpse, having had to negotiate with Everett to even have it cut down after failing to do it myself, and seemed to have tied everything up. Then, one last check, with a 3% chance of success. It was still early enough in the game that I wasn't sure if I wanted to roll on everything, so I almost moved on, but on impulse, I made the roll. Through sheer, blind cop intuition, my guy reaches his hand into the corpse's mouth, shakes it around, looking for something, and against 97% odds to the contrary, finds something. A bullet. The dockworkers' entire story hinges on how they hung the guy. All of that turned out to be post-mortem. For show. It cut through many, many layers of obfuscation and bullshit from the Union boys. In questioning them, I was able to branch almost immediately into the next phase of the investigation and a new set of evidence. Here's the thing. This foreknowledge did not help me even one single bit to counter Everett's schemes. By the end of it, I had done his dirty work on many different fronts and essentially handed him the whole region on a platter. Just how bad is that for Revachol? He used me as an intermediary to manipulate Joyce Messier, to cause her to leave town at the exact moment he needed her to exploit my desire for peace in the city, to push Joyce for concessions that he could not ever personally get out of her. She ceded him the harbor, or said she would, and since no army arrived at the end of the game, it seemed that she kept her word. He got me to talk the poorest of the poor in the city into giving up their neighborhood to his real estate ambitions. Evert Clare cares primarily about power, himself, and the embiggening of both. He's also the most powerful leftist in the city. "Every worker, a member of the board," his catchphrase declares. Two skills I invested heavily in with my character were empathy and drama, both of which made some especially fascinating judgments of Everett. Having high numbers in these skills lets you see through him a bit, pick up on when he's manipulating you and how. When you talk to him about his vision of Revachol as a worker's paradise, you find that he actually believes most of what he's saying. Maybe he's just fooled himself, but the game goes out of its way to demonstrate that some people do not experience hypocrisy within themselves. They can be every bit the fat cat, like Everett is, and still convince people that he's looking out for them because he believes that he is. As the Soviet regime wore on, the most despised kind of person in the popular consciousness was the party official, the true believer who is unable to see not only that they have failed to relinquish the supremacy of their political class, but have held on to the political power of oppression so tightly their fingers have fused into the steering wheel. Evert really does want every worker to be a member of the board. It's just natural that he would be chairman of the board. Natural as breathing. To him. Disco Elysium is one of the most impassioned acts of advocacy for communism that I have ever seen in popular media, but no part of it feels naive or reflexive. Dealing with revolutionaries means also dealing with apparatchiks, the little tyrants, who do believe in the people, but simply don't see themselves in the same category as the unwashed masses. Disco Elysium doesn't have a dragon in it, but it certainly has its nasty reptile sitting on hoards of gold. Some critics feel like this kind of self-sabotage in more forcefully advocating its perspective is evidence that Disco Elysium is pulling its punches. I read an article that Colin Spacetwinks did for Vice called Disco Elysium Was Too Afraid of Sincerity to Be Revolutionary, How Smart Ironic Detachment Limits the Imagination of Last Year's Smartest RPG, that I found extremely compelling, both because of how well it was written, with some excellent prose and a depth of personality, and also because of how completely I disagreed with their points. Colin writes, quote, "Despite the developers' straightforwardness about their beliefs, Disco Elysium cannot let itself be vulnerable, not for very long or very often. Like Harry himself, it's still scared of opening up, still afraid of being mocked, hurt, torn down, and made a fool for wearing their heart on their sleeve and believing that things could ever be different. The rare moments that emotional vulnerability does come by in Disco Elysium, it is quick to stuff it back down and suffocate it with all sorts of qualifications around why and how it showed its true hopes and fears inside of itself. The game quickly retreats back to treating everything as a joke or drenching you in the bleakness of ever dreaming of having something more ambitious and grander for humanity than fleeting minutes of genuine kindness between people in a small neighborhood." End quote. Colin goes on to say, quote, "This is all reinforced with the last scene. You're not going out to fight the revolution. You're going back to being a cop. You're going to try and be a good cop, but you're still a cop. And this is where you're ending up even after the Phasmid told you to do it for the working class. You're returning to a status quo with a better perspective, but you are not shooting for the personal material change that's necessary for Harry, for Revachol, to chase and fight for that belief in communism. Disco Elysium gets so close, but the pain and failure that has shocked the revolutions of our own world spills right into the story of this one. The journey's climax doesn't disappoint me for being abrupt, but because it flinches. It looks away and dials down its expectations and its hopes, from communism to personal kindness, from revolution to a decent police department, maybe. It knows it should ask for more, but Harry and Revachol tried that once before. Once bitten, twice shy, both remain too haunted by their fears of personal and political failure to take any more chances." Full end quote. What I find so compelling about this interpretation, even if I disagree with it, is how I feel like the absolute core of what makes the game sincere is its willingness to temper any idea with the jagged friction of how it fits into the chaos of greater humanity. Disco Elysium is emotionally vulnerable, in my opinion, from start to finish, just not in the raw and straightforward way that a lot of political art is. Vulnerability in Disco Elysium is a weather-beaten and sun-bleached expression of the self, less once bitten, twice shy, as it is decades of beatings with varying severity, deadening the nerves entirely. Colin expresses frustration with how the game tests your comfortability with the idea of purges and other revolutionary violence if you're trying to simply express class solidarity, but that's one of the most important internal processes you have to go through in figuring out if capital letter communism is for you. All you gotta do is read the manifesto, and it will actively demand that you make choices about how far you'll go. There really isn't a disco option here. The entire world of Disco Elysium is designed to throw wrench after wrench into the gears of a person's assumptions. As much as a player can advocate for revolution in its ideal form as the protagonist, you're surrounded by people who are eager to co-opt, sabotage, or violently accelerate the revolution. The detective is only one man. It's only the solipsistic magic of video games which present the illusion that one man is enough to turn the beat around. What fascinates me more about the argument I have with the article is that I think Colin and I are disagreeing less along ideological lines than it is we've ended up presenting as different copotypes. You'd assume that the copotypes in the game are primarily about professional temperament, how interested in the case you are, that copotype is about what kind of cop you are, explicitly. I've come to realize this isn't the case. Your copotype is predicated on the way you respond to despair. The most cutting and personal insult the game lobbed in my direction wasn't about my centrism or anything political at all. It was about my copotype. Sorry cop. The sorriest cop who ever lived. The cop who will, no matter what, extend his deepest sympathies and regrets and then not do very much else. You get the thought, vigorous self-critique, where, when you fail unrepeatable dice rolls, you heal your morale because that failure is exactly what you expected of yourself, and it's heartening to have your self-understanding validated through that failure. Other directions can include Superstar Cop, where failures are dramatically intended to make him look cooler, or Boring Cop, who avoids taking a stand on any issue out of a desire not to seem controversial, or Apocalypse Cop, who doesn't really give a damn because the end is nigh. There's a Facebook feature that was memified where if you get tagged in something, you can mark it, "I'm in this picture and I don't like it," and holy fuck is that sorry cop for me. It's reflexive for me when something bad happens to scale my amount of responsibility for the bad thing, and rarely does that tally out to a true zero. All my life, I've apologized so ubiquitously that at least monthly I get into a loop where someone says, "Quit saying you're sorry, man," and I have to find a way to apologize for that too without, seeming like it. I was never remotely compelled by Apocalypse Cop because it's apparent to me that it's never true that nothing matters, everything matters, and I have personally been fucking up most of it. In Colin's Vice article, they write of feeling seen by the game in a very similar way, but with a completely different copotype than me. They wrote, quote, "As someone who has struggled with depression for more than half my life, I could pinpoint each dodge and defense Harry can use to one I've used myself. But nothing in Harry reminds me of myself in the worst pits of it more than the choices tied to the apocalyptic copotype. I can recall days, months, years spent with the exact same thoughts in my head as Harry, throwing myself into active helplessness so I could at least enjoy not having to actually do anything about it. I hated myself and was miserable every single day, but at least I always had a reason to never do anything about it, to open up my heart enough to have hope again, which meant nobody could ever stomp all over it." End quote. From this perspective, I definitely see more where Colin was coming from in their critique of Disco Elysium's sincerity. If something matters, you should act like it, right? From my perspective, I find it impossible not to contradict and counter-argue any choice I make internally. Before COVID anyway, when I was in a group of people, it used to give me a goddamn panic attack if someone asked me where we should all go for lunch. My brain suddenly starts doing frantic calculations about who likes what and how much to spend, and I'm just stuck there going, because all my options and suggestions have weaknesses you could argue against, and no option is 100% ideal, and it freaks me out to give someone the short end of the stick. That's lunch. Don't even get me started on the way millions of people should organize and live. Here's the thing about sincerity. If Disco Elysium wasn't laying it on the line in as humanistic a way as possible, neither Colin or I would have found ourselves so powerfully within it, and instead, we both did, in almost diagonally opposite ways. It's true that at the end of Disco Elysium, approximately 0.000% of communism has been built, even if you try very hard. I don't think this is flinching. I think it's just what it feels like to be a leftist in our grotesque and duplicitous world. Revolutionary disappointment and regret sit at the actual heart of the crime you're solving in a way that's much more deliberately messy than one ideology over another. First, the crime is Evart tried to exploit. Foreign mercenaries supporting the White Pines Company were in the city. One of them was harassing a woman in town, and when harassment turned to assault, the man was lynched by a mob. This proves the essential inhumanity of the mercenaries and of the foreign interests, justifying the seizure of the White Pines property by the Union. It creates a pervasive us-versus-them environment in which many will see the coming war as justified. Now for the truth as well as you can get it. The essential dynamics of Evert's story aren't fully untrue. The mercenaries are genuinely awful people. They have all been rapists and murderers, more than once in their lives. Just not here in Revachol. Cassia, the assaulted woman, was in a consensual relationship with one of them. She's got a lot of shady stuff going on, and the interplay of your internal voices about her potential guilt is itself an incredible parody of reflexive sexism. She is not an innocent person in a cable TV sense, but she is 100% innocent of the crime. Instead, across the inlet, in a crumbling old revolutionary base, is an old soldier who has been spying on her for months. He's a communard from the original revolution, hiding from the world in the ruins of what he failed to make manifest. He knew the mercenary's type, what the mercenary represented. His ancient resentments and his sexual obsession with Cassia came together while spying on them through his weapon's scope. He took the shot, killing the man mid-orgasm. It was equally a crime of passion as it was a political assassination. Even if you feel the old communard was politically correct, his personal motivation is gross and narcissistic. There's no way to paint it in a fully positive light. The other thing is that by tempering the political motivation with a strong personal one, the failure of the revolution 40 years ago is put into a more meaningful context with the state of the world in the present. This guy did not mean to reignite the international conflict, and yet none of the tensions of 40 years ago have gotten any better. Wounds have festered instead of healing, the situation has become so volatile that all it took was one jealous old man with a rifle to set the town aflame and cause at least 7 deaths in the wake of his actions, though other playthroughs might make that number go up or down. The weird fixation he had with Cassia shifts dramatic focus onto the other conditions in the city that allowed things to so badly spiral out of control, the conditions that sought to take credit for his killing and use it as a tool. It also serves to unite the game's themes. Truth is possible, but people are disappointing. What's most truly beautiful about Disco Elysium for me is the extent to which every character and corridor of the game contribute to the game's artistic message. Nothing in Disco Elysium is purposeless, not even the most tangential things, because it believes we humans are fundamentally tangential creatures. The best parts of ourselves, and the worst parts, are unpredictable, weird, mutable. Everything about us is messy, a lot of it is gross and sad, yet here we are, and we're supposed to figure ourselves out anyway. This is implicit through every tangent and rabbit hole the game offers you, and if that wasn't enough, the game trots out a giant insect to tell you explicitly at the very end. I've got to say that I actually kind of dislike the entire sequence with the Insulindian Phasmid from a dramatic perspective. There's a lot of fantastical stuff within the game already, but the Phasmid is indicated to have also contributed to the actual murderer's cognitive decline, which dilutes what was already the exact correct thickness of moral miasma. It's literally a Deus Ex coastal marsh. More, you use Inland Empire to converse with it, which was already on my shit list of least reliable internal voices, so I was skeptical of the entire thing while it was going on. And maybe that part wasn't, the talking part. But the bug thing is basically real, and even contributes heavily to the question of whether you get to remain a police officer at the end of the game, something I would have liked to have been based exclusively in the non-insect-related choices I made. It's not that I don't appreciate the purpose of the section. It's a powerful climax of the line of thought that began when you first looked in the mirror and thought, my god, what kind of creature is this? Well, now I'll answer that question through contrasting example. Rhetorically useful, dramatically frustrating, distractingly imaginative. I guess even whether the ending lands right depends on how you focused your points in your own internal brain pan. The encounter with the Phasmid is science fiction in the early 60s vein, where the author has a big existential question and they're going to put whatever they have to in front of you to best articulate the big idea. The Phasmid is an ancient creature, but it exists purely in the present. It reacts. It lives. It doesn't question like humans do. It doesn't struggle against itself. It sees your character with equal portions fear and pity. You see, in the margins of the case, you can inquire about the metaphysical circumstances of the world. You have to do it away from your partner, who thinks it's a waste of professional time. Joyce will explain to you something called the Pale. It's like a mist that surrounded all known land. It was thought to be the border of the afterlife. Centuries ago, not too many centuries though, expeditions were sent into the Pale. Most failed, one returned, with news of land on the other side. It was thought to be a paradise, a heaven, an Elysium. But it was just more land. It rocked the cosmological order of society to learn it. After death, life. After the world, more world. The Phasmid says the Pale did not exist in his experience until the humans arrived, that this uncertainty, this clouding of the universe, is based in human thought. Nature has its own clarity. It lives without marking the time, dies in a way that renews itself. Nature is violence without malice, and peace without understanding. The Phasmid tells you, quote, "The moral of our encounter is, I am a relatively median life form, while you are extreme, all-engulfing madness. A volatile, simian nervous system, ominously new to the planet. You are a violent and irrepressible miracle. The vacuum of cosmos and the stars burning in it are afraid of you. Given enough time, you would wipe us all out and replace us with nothing, just by accident." End quote. Human experience is not only fundamentally absurdist, according to the Phasmid, the absurdity of it has terrifying implications. It pushes the universe towards absurdist instabilities. The Pale represents those implications. The future is unknowable to us in a way that would be incomprehensible to our ancestors. These questions that are so large, questions of revolution and progress, questions of violence and regression, questions of love and hatred, have, in fact, physically reshaped the planet, not the Disco Elysium one, our own actual Earth. Every other life form is just keeping up with, as the Phasmid puts it, our extreme and all-engulfing madness. It isn't just in Dungeons & Dragons cosmology that thought and opinion end up creating the substance of the cosmos. It's just only in Dungeons & Dragons that our beliefs manifest in such neatly defined patterns. There's one bit in Planescape Torment that Disco Elysium proudly borrows on a mostly one-for-one basis, and that's the content revolving around your protagonist's name. In Torment, you learn your true name at the end, and even then it's a private thing kept hidden from the player. You are, throughout, the Nameless One. Except you can lie to people and make up an identity for yourself anyway, Adan. Refer to yourself this way in at least 11 circumstances, and Adan will appear in the world, confused about how he got there, but sure that the two of you are friends somehow. It's a neat little illustration of the principle of belief altering the fabric of the universe the way it does in the planes. In Disco Elysium, when first meeting your case partner after having woken up from your amnesia-inducing bender, you can fuck up the difficult role to make up a good name to present yourself as, and refer to yourself instead as Raphael Ambrosius Costo. Much later on, you find your police badge in a police motor carriage you apparently drove off a bridge into the bay some days earlier. Your name is Harrier Dubois. Harry, casually. In Torment, recalling your true name is a climactic existential achievement. In Disco Elysium, it's more of a turning point. Are you still Harrier Dubois? Do you like what you know of the man? Is there something worth salvaging? Or are you, perhaps, instead, Raphael Ambrosius Costo, after all? Is your name any more goddamn ridiculous than anything else in this godforsaken city? Fuck no, and fuck you for good measure. I will be signing my initials RAC from here on out. Identity is, after all, a declarative act. Even if people tell you who you are able to vehemently disagree. I didn't end up keeping RAC, however, because of the melancholy I felt for Harrier Dubois. The photo he used for his badge is over a decade out of date, but he looks so much better in it. In my game, I tried rather earnestly to solve the case in a professional way, even if I went on some questionable tangents. When it came to evidence and questioning, I figured there must be a reason that Harrier woke up detective. Could the amnesia be a way to reset his relationship with justice instead of breaking off entirely? I wanted Harry to heal. A part of his misery is that 6 years ago his wife left him. His wife left because he was already self-indulgently unstable, though, so it is not the root cause. But it was dumping gallons of accelerant on his smoldering despondency. The only chance given at reconciliation is simply having the courage towards the end of the game to confront the memory of it. Reliving it is so painful for Harry that prior to the endgame, even attempting to recall the substance of your empty, awful sense of a lurking X-something causes damage to morale and health. To reject your character's true name is rewarding in some ways, but I found more resonance in trying to redeem the one that was forgotten. 44 years is a lot of living to toss aside, no matter how filled with failure and anger those years might be. The quest structure might be uncannily similar, but the meaning of your true name and what you're able to do with it is, in the end, substantially different. It would be so easy to have Harry's past be a complete joke, to be satirically exaggerated and distorted, and there's some element of that excess in the remembrances and the dream sequences, admittedly. I was moved by it anyway. I found Harry's past pains to be just as humanistically portrayed as everything else, a portrait of an essentially decent person drowning in confusion, bitterness, and self-loathing. After drowning for years and destroying almost every meaningful part of himself, he washes up on a strange and distant shore, where our game begins. Just as I wanted to see how the game would react if I tried to articulate my political views in the dialogue, I found so many of my own anxieties and fears reflected in the dialogue choices. Could I help Harry the way I'd like to help myself? It turned out that I could, and that, like in real life, the easier option is to simply let him drown. Not only do suicide and self-harm come up naturally in the course of the story and the interplay of internal voices for your character, like any other notion in Disco Elysium, you can push it even farther. At first I was kind of shocked to see how far you could push it, but the way they've done it is sympathetic and, to me, familiar. Artistically, the choices to try to heal are made much more meaningful by an equally available antithesis where you've determined for yourself that it'll just get worse instead. There's a lot of truth to structuring it that way. Trying to be kinder to yourself, trying to improve, is not only difficult and uncomfortable, but also, frankly, boring. Why tell yourself to forgive yourself? Forget about it, when you already have a 100-point presentation on how everything about you is fundamentally unforgivable and worthless. It's a mixtape of misery, each song carefully chosen and arranged by you, for maximum effect. So, Disco Elysium presents you with Finger on the Eject button, a thought that lets you present to the world with extra authority and confidence because you seem so devil-may-care. This is because every day you toy with the idea of it being your last day and have to make daily dice rolls or else kill yourself like you've been threatening to do. Mechanically, it seems modeled on Mel Gibson's character in Lethal Weapon, who certainly is better at authority and suggestion because of his obvious death wish. Thematically, it seems modeled on a more standard issue, deep depression. Everyone's depression feels deeply personal, of course. It has unique qualities to every person, but the basic shape of it is oddly uniform. It's why you can feel like the only person in the world who feels like you feel, but when you go in to see a therapist, they've already printed out a checklist with most of those feelings arranged in rows. Suicidal thoughts are one of those things that I found to follow those improbably impersonal patterns. Sometimes for an hour, or sometimes for days, but always just a monotonous, droning loop of self-hatred. Quote, turns out Finger on the Eject Button is pretty much your theme song, a headbanger from your teenage years and your wedding ballad. This is not the first time you're spinning the tape, says Disco Elysium. The monotony of it is often what makes it feel convincing. It doesn't matter if you've actually found happiness or you're doing well, it's still the same mixtape, again and again. Forever. You learn that while alone and trashing your hotel room during the drinking binge you can't remember, other guests heard you through the walls screaming, "I don't want to be this kind of animal anymore!" and playing a song called The Smallest Church in Sansan over and over and over. You can find that song and sing it at karaoke. Not just can, you are absolutely compelled to do so. It's a hell of a moment, especially if you fail the role, because it's an incredibly heartfelt expression of the self for Harry that he is completely, absurdly unable to convey to anyone else in the room, despite having a microphone and their undivided attention. It's like the Phasmid said, humans are a violent and irrepressible miracle. We have within ourselves the capacity for creation and destruction towards ourselves as much as any other point of focus, and in both cases, the song is often the same. Pain, sadness, regret. The end of the song, Harry's song, is to say that none of it matters. None of it matters at all. But of course that isn't true. If it was true, he wouldn't be singing it. Yet he wouldn't be singing it either if he didn't feel it was true. Humans are an absolute paradox. Towards the end of the game, when things were nearly wrapped up, the game had a suicidal thought come up suddenly, almost unprompted. I was on the seashore, looking into the waves, and it said, just walk. Walk into them. Let the ocean take you. You would not be missed. Your options, without the active thought to kill yourself at least, are just to shake your head and walk away. The case, it's almost done. And in my own life, I found that kind of thing to be true as well. I never defeat the thoughts. I never have a hallmark moment where I stand up to it like a playground bully. I just think, right now is a little inconvenient. There's shit I told people I would do. It's not that I deserve to live, but that it would heap a whole lot of extra work and bullshit on people for me to die. Paperwork, bad vibes, the like. When media touches on an issue like suicide and puts it in a game, as an option like this, it is very important to ask the question of whether it's glorifying suicide or sensationalizing it. For Disco Elysium, I don't think at all that that's the case. If it's not your first time spinning the tape, you know pretty well to recognize the tune. Seems like we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff and only intermittently about police work, doesn't it? That's Disco Elysium for you. We'd never be able to talk about all the stuff we have, though, without the frame and the momentum of the case itself. Not only does the case provide a reason to talk to so many strangers at such length, doing case work regarding the murder requires a completely different perspective and philosophy than the existential detective work you're doing in trying to figure out who your protagonist is as a human. This more clinical, professional perspective is articulated by the ever-watchful gaze of your police partner, Kim Kitsuragi. Lieutenant Kitsuragi is one of the truly good people you meet. He is dependable, completely trustworthy, acts with decency and some amount of compassion, and he also stands as one of the very few characters who aren't hypocrites. Oddly, he's a moralist, or a centrist. It's extremely interesting to compare the shade the game throws at centrism as a worldview and concept with the sympathy that it has for the lieutenant. The thought about moralism is called the kingdom of the conscience. It posits, quote, "Heartache is powerful, but democracy is subtle. Incrementally, you begin to notice a change in the weather. When it snows, the flakes are softer when they stick to your worry-worn forehead. When it rains, the rain is warmer. Democracy is coming to the administrative region. The ideals of DeLorean humanism are reinstating themselves. How can they not? These are the ideals of the Coalition and the Moralist International. Those guys are signal blue. And they're not only good, they're also powerful. What will it be like once their nuanced plans have been realized?" And then it answers itself by saying, quote, "The kingdom of conscience will be exactly as it is now. Moralists don't really have beliefs. Sometimes they stumble on one, like a child's toy left on the carpet. The toy must be put away immediately, and the child reprimanded. Centrism isn't change, not even incremental change. It is control over yourself and the world. Exercise it. Look up at the sky, the dark shapes of coalition airships hanging there. Ask yourself, is there something sinister in moralism? And then answer, no. God is in his heaven. Everything is normal on earth. End quote. Kim Kitsuragi isn't spared this judgment. In fact, if anything at all is clear about him by the end of the game, it's that he is not a friend to radical change. He's a true believer in his institution, and in many ways he's integrated the job into his deeper self. Professionalism is one of the major lenses through which he sees the world, and Harry looks extremely wanting through it most of the time. Kim Kitsuragi's goal is not to change the system. His goal is to do the job given to him by that system. However, Kim's willing to work with Harry and even become friends with him because his sense of professionalism essentially transcends ideology. If there was a crime, there was evidence, motivation, a culprit. Arrange these things and you can discover the truth. Not just a truth, not just your truth, but the capital letter version that accurately describes a thing that happened. If Harry is working towards this reality, he can be an absolutely gigantic communist and still be an ally to empirical truth. Moralists don't really have beliefs, the game had opined, and in a certain way that is truer for Kim than anyone else, but not in a wholly negative way. It's less that he believes in the rightness of the status quo so much as he's simply accepted the shape of it. Kim believes in what is demonstrably true, the reality in front of him. If that reality challenges him, he accepts the new reality, like what happens with the Phasmid. The Phasmid happened. He won't deny it happened just because it's insane. Kim has a deeply human and, yes, moral center to him that he never strays too far from. It's not prescriptive, though. It's not imaginative. For him, moralism is the philosophy of the perpetual observer. Kim can describe the shape of the world and its whys and its hows as well as anyone employing critical theory. He just isn't willing to go the extra step to say if this is right or wrong outside of extreme and obvious circumstances. One of the most fascinating moments revolving around Kim and police work is largely tangential to your investigation. A couple days into the case, there was an old woman outside the bookstore. I was given an option to try and bait her into giving me a side quest, basically pestering her if she had any missing pets or maybe a missing spouse, and I could track him down, because I'm a detective, you see. I detect, and right now I detect that you might pay me or something for something like that. It seems like a satirical riff on the typical RPG protagonist behavior, and it is very funny just as that. But Disco Elysium turns the screws down a little tighter on it until it completely transforms into something else. Much later, I found a frozen corpse on an abandoned boardwalk. A drunk. Slipped, hit his head, passed out, died in the cold. Could have been Harry, really. Ought to have been, perhaps, except for some lucky breaks. This is that woman's husband. He actually was missing. You actually did find him. Not as a joke, but for deadly serious. Once you confirm the man's identity, you have to visit the old woman in her apartment and deliver the news in person. In this scene, there is no trace of irony or meta-commentary, just deep, very personal, very true despair. Think for a moment if Harrier Dubois' wife had stayed, even as he drank more, even as he refused to heal. Don't the odds say that this would be her fate one cold and windy night sometime in the deep future? Learning that her husband died for certain after years and years of feeling he died on the inside somehow anyway? Mourning the death? Regardless? Realizing that she's completely alone now, alone and having already spent the years of her life on someone who ended up preferring the icy embrace of death to her company? It's more of a sad and bitter moment than most other games would dare put in, memorably cutting, not just because it's edgy, but because it's so concretely plausible and real. This happens. This happens a lot. These pains are all around us. In this moment, Harry turns to Kim as a role model, seeks his approval in addressing the woman with compassion. We as players, or even Harry as a character, depending on how you play him, might judge Kim for his refusal to address the bigger picture, his refusal to advocate for change in any meaningful way. Yet, the lieutenant's skill in the smaller picture is powerful, delicate, and undeniable. His politically reserved nature is, like so many other things in the game, a response to despair and pain. He's tuned into the people in front of him tightly enough that it is only his professionalism and the emotional armor that professionalism provides that allows him to keep going. If the lieutenant opened himself up to more big-picture, long-future questions like Harry does, well, he would open himself up to the same existential dangers as well, wouldn't he? Relentless self-doubt, confrontations with his limitations as a human animal, throwing into question not just what is in the world, but why it matters. There's a lot of danger in that. Empiricism, by contrast, is a comfort. Truth is a refuge, an island of immutable reality in the endless mists of the pale, the unknowable chaos of human thought and desire. Kim lives on that island. He does not venture beyond the pale. Disco Elysium treats this choice with a massive amount of sympathy, considering its general attitude regarding moralism and centrism. I've heard people say that Disco Elysium is cynical. In places, it absolutely is. Its core, I think, is not. Disco Elysium is not expecting a right answer to the questions of life, the universe, and everything. It's trying to tell us that it's normal for it to be this painful for us to have to choose an answer anyway. This is what I mean about the interconnectedness of every character and conversation in the game. Things that are jokes become serious. Criminal evidence provokes political opinion. Strangers see you clearly while friends know you not at all. The world is ugly, cruel, beautiful, miraculous. The exterior map of the game isn't divided into regions with loading screens. It is all one city, all one place. The word city just describes the aggregate total of all the contradictory, unsustainable madness of its inhabitants and its history. There's a thought you can get where part of the benefit is that you're able to literally zoom out the game camera further. You can picture more concurrent, overlapping lives. I've seen some players express frustration with how lengthy the conversations are with characters who don't seem to serve a specific gameplay or plot purpose, and so go on to describe these characters as filler NPCs, even though tangential encounters represent the bulk of what Disco Elysium is. On occasion, the game will zoom way, way out, quietly, letting the sounds of the city rise and blend and fade together. If Disco Elysium is about any one thing more than another, its intention is clear in those moments. Nothing can stand alone. Disentangling yourself from the messiness of the world is impossible. You are part of that mess. You leave behind your own stains and burn marks and broken glass as you go along. Truth is singular in execution and kaleidoscopic in understanding. How many truths, after all, did you have to sift through to find one that lived up to the name? You might have talked to someone who had nothing to say about the case, but a lot to say about the notion of justice. Is that not relevant? How about the dumbass teenagers throwing rocks at the corpse of your murder victim? He has nothing to do with any of it, exactly, except the social circumstances that create a little shitbag like him are extremely material to the case. Throughout the game, each conversation, each moment is a little dot of color. Right next to each other, they're just dots, clashing dots, contrasting dots. Zoom out far enough, and the dots blur into each other. The pattern resolves. It becomes a portrait that you can comprehend in aggregate in a way that seemed impossible up close. Disco Elysium is a role-playing game whose internal conception of roles is absolutely unique among video games and other media. It is an intensely unlikely thing to have in the world at all. An international super hit, hot out of the capital of Estonia, with no formal combat system, no microtransactions, and no respect for the corporate apoliticism that dominates games writing. Disco Elysium is art in the best, boldest possible way. Like trying to sing the smallest church in Sansan at karaoke, Disco Elysium is trying to cram a lifetime of emotion and experience into a tight 3-minute set with no guarantee whatsoever the audience will vibe with any of it. Creatively speaking, it is risking much, much more than most games ever do. It's not just a gameplay loop or a business concept being tested. Disco Elysium is art about being human, what that's like, how fucking weird and scary and confusing it is. If Disco Elysium failed, it wouldn't feel like, say, a roguelike failing, where you can argue that the flaw was in marketing or gameplay. If Disco Elysium failed, it would be because it was not able to communicate the delicate and difficult things the developers were trying to communicate. Failure for Disco Elysium would mean the world saying, I don't get it. Instead, Disco Elysium is a massive hit, a modern classic. Its humanity allows it to exist outside of trends in gaming in a way that only the very best games ever do. It's that big of a hit because people do get it. It's a conversation people are hungry to have because it's a conversation about truth and meaning. Those things are rare and hidden to begin with. We grasp for them so clumsily and messily. Even when we find them, we often break them or lose them. That's okay, Disco Elysium says. I know how you feel. Let me tell you about the time I got so drunk I forgot the world and had to learn it all over again. It's a hell of a story if you find the time. Thanks for watching. This video, and all the videos I do, are only made possible through donations that I get through the crowdfunding website Patreon. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to make that happen. People like Alex Hansen, Leo Neal, Connor McLeod, Eli Bergmass, John Paul Queller, James Sullivan, Aaron Williams, Zach Millington, Soeb Sheik, Eddie Burton, Carol Henderson, Callie Buffalo, Jason McAmer, Caleb Brennan, Marcello Ferrara, BK, Caru Hogue, Daniel Phillips, Selah, Tyler Robinson, Corey Bofill, Jack Dawson, Dennis Clark, Stephen Garrett Day, Jake Mays, You're My Favorite YouTuber, Sam Birkland, Simon Murray, Mr. Mush, Kumaran Vijan, Nobody, World War II Freak, Alexander Leister, Igor Babiuk, Argus, Morgan Moll, Brian Hill, Julian Renault, Agandine, T. Kelly, Jared Meyer, Hannah Parker, Arian Adair, Jeremy Kirby, Snuffleupagus, Blue Bishop, Shane, Dave S., Nolan Pete, Blaze J., Craig Farrell, Pascal Moser, Jake McWilliams, David S., Michael Zetilnik, Anaphylaxis, LL, Ross Dexter, Claire Gilliam, Brendan Buchanan, Dylan Cabau, Scott Dick, Lackey, Aaron Hendricks, Marius Lobonshu, Angus Monroe, The Roadie 451, Alec Barcelos, Simon Lilburn, Kuzaz Greslick, Timothy Cole, James Stevenson, Alex, Chris Harink, Stuart Jackson, Jeremy Hillier, Eric Strickland, Nick Corisset, Magnus K., Avra Tavares, Kirk Fury, Joe Joyce, Rich to the Ardio, Jack Holmes, Frogfoot, Gabriel Burnson, Hunter Rasmussen, Yarrow 12, Sky Swanson, Jonathan Harrison, Ethan David Stapley, C. Soldier Hawk, Jimbo, Michael Hazani, Sean Hansen, Willer Niekirk, Dr. Crime, Oyvind Garvind, Joseph Smith, Alastair Struck, Beth Leuenberger, Daniel Sarusi, Smite Me Now, Alexi Arp Olivi, Andrew Suso, ADC 400, MJ, Dorian Sanchez, Eamon McNeely, Julius Januskevicius, Sab Aka Ducka, Rocco Giacomo, David Schurman, LIYWJL, Austin Aloisi, Recommission, Dylan Scott Isgar, Blind Fighting, Evil Bread, Spot, Ted Latas, Jacob Sindelar, Melody Redacted, Faraz Atala, Martin Peterson, Stephen Thompson, Angus Cunningham, Louis Lorati, Tilts, Lucas Staneland, Preston Maclizio, Oshi, Ken Ollendorf, James Hull, Brandon Martin Sinkus, Philip Woolley, Sam Zeitlin, Timothy Lee Peterson, Commissar, Colin McRae, Noops, Matt Donahue, Raven Rises, Christopher Clack, Morton Ansheim, David Kassan, Joe Freund, Peyton Helix, Harrison Pruce, Aidan Hensel, Avery Thorpe, Andy Gershony, Texas Dan, Jack Romaine, Snowhole, Jay Mackery, Brett Brothers, Jonathan Faherty, Adventure Top, Merrick James, Cato, Bailey DeHaco, Sean Murphy, Tech, Dylan McCarthy, James Brendan, I'm sorry about that, Matthew, Dominic Hickman, Augustin Castro, Kyle Parliament, Adam Finley, Matt Leffler, William Klein, Jack Estop, Aldo Curtis, Jim McGeehan, Stickman Grit, Finley M, Jeremy Harris, Haitian 95, Gethin Riss Binns, Benjamin Glover, Ryan Francom, Samuel Murphy, Gamp, Daria, Steve Belgard, Evan Barnett, Armuda, Chris Dobbs, Gaspard Fleury Hurtabiza, Kate Stock, Nikolai Vladimirov, Liam Pierce, Justin Michael, Darius Rudeminer, The Drunken Manatee, Thomas Watkins, Jack Shahan, Matthew Allen Kelsey, Jared K., Matthias Vanden Bosch, Michael DeMichelle, Genosian, Stimson Sneed, ICR 7, Thomas Culligan, Brian Barrow, Roberticus 1995, Greg, Chris Teckenton, Evan, Vodka Blitz, Kirk Battle, Riley Bozarth, Jeff Sang, Stephen Plovan, Eric Goose, Levi Thomas, Stephen, Haste Guy, Sean Sovey, Doomed Sheridan, Sophia Naylor, Alexander Smith, Epitome 22, Jed, Devona Uparak, Konstantin Ivanov, Logan Hickman, Danston, Tyson Cock, JRG 123, Liam White, April Mahan, Zachary Leonard Roper, Wolf in White Van, Sergeant QQ, Trinant, Matthew Burns, Symmetry Master, Aaron Dembski-Bowden, Matthias Campbell, Roguethrax, Keone Warby, Thomas Fielding, Eli Youngs, Space Wizard 63, Arnie HD, Maxwell Bohm, Thomas Vavasour, Jay Calder, Tyler R. Smith, Patrick Morrison, Alex McDonald, Kevin Morris, Allison Sugar, Brianna Manassa, Dave, Alexander Clatworthy, Ron Gervais, Vadim Flax, Kazuhira, Kyle Zimes, Colin Stoltz, Nicholas, Pieface, Ottavio Albanese, Ethan Hayes, Howard Knutson, Peter H., Reese Kittleson, Grogan, Eric Jensen, Phil Harding, Elijah King, Imran Momuki, Max Barros, Patrick Gaumont, Tyler Lambert, Patrick Mills, Miezko Zaha, Callum TM, Bryn Gelbart, Dralax789, Deeb, The Rambling Bard, Highland Fox, Well-Tempered Clavier, William Povard, Quainan, Matthew Shyrock, Vivek Raghuran, Dragon Cobalt, Asbjorn Viol Kvalbian, Owen Tirla, Cold Beans, Bob Mitchum, Tyler King, Stephen Lovedance, Charlotte M3, Ivan Echeverria, Cobra, Adam NH, Load Galax, Alex Williams, William J. Gorman, Leighton Carden, James Henderson, Zachary Ziemba, Juju Beans, John Soklowski, Matthew Richard Teubner, Austin Matheson, Scott Muck, SG Response, Tiernan Garces, James Gray, Cale Perrian, Vitor Tumoli, Jared A. Hicks, Garrett Johnson, Han Jiping, Jacob Wanish, Max Cohen, Shieldwall, Leo Peril, Markalef, Tyler F., William Tung, Conceited Axis, Bryn Davies, James Mosca, Victor Felton, S. Engvall, Jeffrey McIntyre, Marcin Zarad, Levi Whitney, Dakian Delamast, Nikolai, Elijah Nelson, Sam Bellmeyer, Byron Callan, Eric Amundsen, Noah Kantrowitz, Tinfoil Pancakes, Maurice Dessereau, Manu Weedman, Greg Rucka, Low Beyonder, Gilosum, Vance Jordan Falls, Ralph Rainwater, Alexander Romanov, Kazra Fadausafard, Patrick McGranahan, Robot Ghost, Jeremy Saunders, Stephen Heim, Ryan Snyder, April, Jacob McMillan, Eric Joyner, Edward Clayton Andrews, Angelo Sucaras, Ian Glascock, C.E. Keene, Shiny Wolf, El Weasel, Wernerol Herzog, Daniel Orn Christensen, Thomas Lee, me, Namo Vindenbrink, the Nikaforovs, Ben Wellard, J.S., Greg Merles, Jordan Klein, Sky Jansen, Daniel Floyd, Mark Phillips, Andrew Tapp, Kevin Schaub, Matthew Sutton, Tizar Vicarian, David Carlson, Kisser, Avery Holmes, David Harpstreit, Matthew Mason, Simon Shaw, Josh, Obelisk Art History, Matthew Cassidy, Will Dobbins, Clay Harrington, Tom Rowerdink, Quitch, Devin Vernon, Kyle Zahner, N.K. Jennison, John Fry, Gustav Lindstedt, Michael Atwell, Evan Hill, Andrew Opplinger, I Cannot Fly, Nick Cole Hamilton, Oscar Stangenberg, Colin, Adam Howard, Dewey, Comfy Hat, Aurelian, Andrew Boissonneau, Pascal Moret, Alexander Sunden, Zach B., Lascelles, Toadheart, Thomas Whitty, Nefertem 93, The Soul James, Fergus Foley, Dijon Wan, K.H. Maker D., Argus Swift, Ranger Ridiculous, Cybot D., Kim Winson, Andreas Larson, Anthony Bardill, Sean, Philip A. Coffey, Brian Plockelman, Jesse Wilkison, Devin Fitzpatrick, Tim Marsh, Colin Bassnett, Jeanette N., Carl Gleason, Yazan Barghouti, Dios, Ricardo Genda, Rich Stewart, Adrian Kumale, Nate Tenzar, Tom Painter, Jared Olszewski, Eric Jepson, Q-Ray X, Alex Salato, The Bloke, Sasha Ya, Lucas Marcondes de More, Peter Flink, Andy Bennett, and Krimgi Schlepeps, along with many others who donate a smaller amount. It's you guys who keep these videos going, and I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you.